The discovery of Claire's growing suspicion of Rebecca gave the detectives a new direction. Until then, much of their investigation had centered on Daniel, their relationship, and the events surrounding Claire's disappearance. But as detectives began interviewing people who had known Claire closely, a different picture slowly emerged. Claire had not simply been heartbroken after Daniel left her. She had become increasingly concerned about Rebecca. Friends described small changes in Claire's behavior during the weeks before everything happened. She asked unusual questions. She revisited conversations she had once dismissed. She began paying closer attention whenever Rebecca talked about her childhood, her previous relationships, or the years before she met Daniel. At first, Claire had assumed the inconsistencies were harmless. Then she started noticing too many of them. One person remembered Claire saying that Rebecca had changed parts of her story several times. Another recalled Claire asking whether anyone knew Rebecca before she moved to the area. A third remembered Claire becoming quiet whenever Rebecca's past was mentioned. The detectives began piecing those comments together. And slowly, they discovered something Claire herself had never expected to uncover. Months earlier, Rebecca had trusted Claire with a secret. It happened during one of their private conversations, when Rebecca had finally opened up about a traumatic relationship from her past. She had described a period of her life she desperately wanted to leave behind. According to Claire's notes, Rebecca had spoken about someone who had once controlled her life and about decisions she had made during that relationship that she now regretted. Rebecca had been emotional when she told Claire. She had asked her friend to promise that the story would never leave that room. Claire had promised. For a long time, she kept that promise. Even when Rebecca became closer to Daniel, Claire said nothing. Even when she noticed details that did not quite match what Rebecca had previously told her, she remained silent. She believed protecting a friend meant protecting the things that friend was ashamed of. But Daniel's departure changed everything. After Daniel left Claire and began building a new life with Rebecca, Claire could no longer convince herself that silence was the right choice. Her anger was real, but so was her fear. She did not want Rebecca destroyed. She wanted Daniel to understand. So Claire began collecting information. She saved messages. She wrote down dates. She compared things Rebecca had told her with information she could independently confirm. She revisited old conversations and searched for connections between Rebecca's different versions of the past. It was not an attempt to ruin Rebecca immediately. Claire seemed to be building a case. She wanted proof strong enough that Daniel could no longer dismiss her concerns as jealousy. In one flashback, Claire sits alone at her kitchen table, surrounded by printed messages and handwritten notes. She studies a photograph on her phone, then looks toward a notebook filled with names and dates. Her expression is no longer that of a woman simply mourning a relationship. She looks determined. But Claire was not the only person noticing the change. Rebecca soon realized that something was happening. She noticed Claire asking questions she had never asked before. She noticed the pauses during conversations. She noticed that Claire no longer accepted vague answers. Most importantly, Rebecca understood exactly what Claire might be looking for. The secret, the one thing Rebecca had trusted Claire to protect. The possibility that Claire might reveal it terrified her. Rebecca knew Daniel did not know the complete story of her past. She also knew that if he discovered the truth from someone else, their new relationship could collapse before it had even truly begun. That fear quickly turned into desperation. According to the detectives, Rebecca began behaving differently whenever Claire was mentioned. She became defensive. She avoided certain subjects. She reportedly asked mutual acquaintances what Claire had been saying about her. Meanwhile, Claire continued gathering evidence. She did not confront Rebecca immediately. Perhaps she was waiting for the right moment. Perhaps she still hoped Daniel would listen before the situation became irreversible. But the more Claire discovered, the more dangerous the situation became. One evening, Claire received a message that appeared to confirm one of the inconsistencies she had been investigating. She read it several times before saving a copy. Then she wrote a single sentence in her notebook. Daniel needs to know. That sentence would become one of the most important clues in the entire investigation. Because Claire had finally made a decision. She was going to tell Daniel what she knew. And somewhere else, Rebecca was beginning to realize that Claire's promise of silence might no longer protect her. The friendship between them had reached its breaking point. What happened next would depend on one question. How far was Rebecca willing to go to keep her secret buried? The question of how far Rebecca was willing to go was still hanging over the investigation when detectives began reconstructing the final 7 days of Claire's life. What first appeared to be a relationship dispute quickly became a timeline, each day adding another piece to a puzzle neither Daniel nor Rebecca could complete. Day 1 began with Daniel leaving Claire. At first, nothing seemed suspicious. Daniel packed his belongings, left the home they had shared, and went to stay with Rebecca. From the outside, it looked like the final stage of a relationship already falling apart. But Claire did not accept the separation quietly. Messages from that day showed that she was hurt, angry, and determined to understand why Daniel had chosen Rebecca. She asked Daniel for an honest explanation. He insisted his decision had already been made. By day 2, Claire had confronted Rebecca. The confrontation was not witnessed, but people close to both women remembered that something changed afterward. Claire accused Rebecca of hiding important parts of her past. Rebecca reportedly denied everything and told Claire that she was trying to destroy her relationship with Daniel. Claire left with more questions than answers. Then came day 3. Rebecca received another threatening message. The wording was alarming, but investigators could not prove who sent it. Rebecca believed Claire was responsible. She told people that Claire had become obsessed with exposing her and would stop at nothing to get Daniel back. But detectives noticed something important. Rebecca never produced a clear explanation for how she knew the message had come from Claire. By day 4, the pressure was beginning to affect Daniel. For the first time, he started questioning whether Rebecca had told him everything about her past. He reportedly asked her about several details Claire had raised. Rebecca attempted to reassure him, insisting that Claire was twisting old information because she was angry. But Daniel's doubts did not disappear. Instead, they created distance between him and Rebecca. Day 5 brought the first major break in Claire's routine. She did not appear at work. Her absence concerned people who knew her. Claire was reliable, and there was no obvious reason for her disappearance. Calls went unanswered. Messages received no response. Investigators believed something had already happened. But the timeline became even more troubling on day 6. Daniel claimed that he had no contact with Claire. He told detectives that after leaving her, he had kept his distance. According to his account, he did not see her, speak to her, or invite her anywhere. Rebecca supported the general version of events. Yet their stories contained small differences. One conversation did not match another. A time mentioned by Daniel conflicted with a detail Rebecca had provided. Neither contradiction seemed significant on its own, but together they created a pattern investigators could not ignore. Then came day 7. Claire's body was discovered in Daniel's backyard. The location transformed everything inside the investigation itself. Daniel's earlier claim that he had no contact with Claire suddenly became much harder to accept. If he truly had not seen her, detectives needed to understand how Claire had ended up on property connected to him. Daniel offered an explanation. He claimed Claire had been emotionally unstable and might have followed him and Rebecca to the house. He suggested that she could have arrived without his knowledge. Rebecca offered a different version. She said Claire had threatened to ruin her life and had become increasingly unpredictable. To Rebecca, Claire's disappearance was another example of how far the situation had spiraled. But neither explanation answered the central question. What happened to Claire after she entered the neighborhood? Detectives obtained surveillance footage from nearby cameras and began watching the recordings frame by frame. Then they saw her. On the night she disappeared, Claire entered the neighborhood. She was alone. The footage confirmed that she had arrived in the area, exactly as Daniel had suggested might have happened. But there was one devastating problem with his explanation. The cameras never showed Claire leaving. Not on foot, in a vehicle, or through any visible route captured by the surrounding surveillance. She entered the neighborhood, and then, according to every available camera, she vanished. That discovery changed the entire timeline. Claire had not simply disappeared somewhere unknown. She had entered a specific area connected to Daniel and Rebecca, and the evidence suggested that something happened there before her body was discovered. Now detectives had to determine what the cameras could not show. Who met Claire after she arrived? Who was with her? And most importantly, why did neither Daniel nor Rebecca tell the detectives that she had been there? Those questions pushed the investigation toward the house itself, where detectives would soon uncover evidence that could challenge everything both of them had claimed. The questions surrounding Claire's final movements led detectives directly to the house. Surveillance had placed her in the neighborhood, In the absence of any footage showing her leave, investigators had to consider what happened inside those walls. According to the evidence they gathered, Claire had arrived carrying a folder. Inside were documents, photographs, copies of messages, and notes she had collected during the days since Daniel left. She was no longer coming to argue about their relationship. She had come because she believed Daniel deserved to know something about Rebecca. When Daniel opened the door, he was immediately surprised to see her. Claire asked to speak with him privately. Daniel reportedly told her that there was nothing left to discuss. He had made his choice, and Claire needed to accept it. But Claire refused to leave. She placed the folder on the table and opened it. One photograph, then another, then several printed messages. Daniel looked through them, becoming increasingly frustrated. Claire told him that Rebecca had lied to him about something important. She said the details of Rebecca's past were not what Daniel believed, and that she had proof. Daniel did not respond with curiosity. He responded with anger. He accused Claire of trying to sabotage his new relationship because she could not accept that he had moved on. He told her that everything she was doing looked like revenge. Claire listened quietly. Then she reminded him that she had spent months keeping Rebecca's confidence. She had protected Rebecca's secret even when doing so hurt her. But now, after Daniel had left her and chosen Rebecca, Claire could no longer remain silent while watching him build a future based on information he did not have. The conversation became more personal. Claire admitted that she never wanted to lose Daniel. She told him that despite everything that had happened, part of her still wished he had chosen differently. But then her voice changed. She said she was finished begging him to stay. If Daniel wanted Rebecca, that was his decision. Claire would not chase him anymore. What she could not accept, however, was allowing him to make that decision without knowing the truth. Daniel reportedly asked her what truth she was talking about. Claire pushed the folder toward him. She told him Rebecca's secret was much worse than he realized. Daniel demanded an explanation. He wanted names, dates, and proof. Claire began to answer. She told him that the story Rebecca had shared with her years earlier was not the complete story. Important details had been changed. Certain events had been deliberately omitted. And one person connected to Rebecca's past had never been mentioned to Daniel at all. Daniel stared at Claire. For the first time, his anger appeared to give way to uncertainty. He asked why Claire had waited so long. She answered that she had promised Rebecca she would never reveal what had been told to her in confidence. Then Daniel asked the question that changed everything. What made her break that promise? Claire looked directly at him. She explained that she had discovered evidence suggesting Rebecca was still hiding something. Something connected to the relationship she had described as being entirely in her past. Daniel wanted to know what that meant. Claire opened her mouth to explain. Then the front door opened. Rebecca had arrived. For a moment, nobody spoke. She looked at Claire, then at the folder, then at Daniel. Her expression changed immediately. She understood what Claire had brought with her. Claire stood beside the table, refusing to back away. Daniel turned toward Rebecca and asked why she had never told him about the things Claire had discovered. Rebecca did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at Claire and accused her of breaking a promise. Claire replied that promises mattered, but so did the truth. The argument quickly escalated. Daniel demanded that Rebecca explain herself. Rebecca insisted Claire was manipulating him. Claire told Daniel to look at the evidence before deciding whom to believe. For the first time, all three were trapped inside the same conversation, with no friend, message, or distance left to soften the conflict. Daniel stood between the two women he had trusted. Rebecca was desperate to protect the life she had built with him. Claire was determined to make him see what she believed had been hidden. And on that night, the secret that had remained buried for so long was finally within reach of the truth. But before Claire could reveal the most important piece of evidence, something happened that would change the confrontation forever. The detectives would later focus on those missing minutes, because whatever happened next was never captured clearly on camera. Those missing minutes would become the disputed part of the entire investigation for years afterward. Those missing minutes from Claire's final confrontation immediately changed the direction of the investigation. Until that point, detectives had been dealing with conflicting stories, incomplete evidence, and a timeline that refused to make sense. Now there was another problem. Rebecca had been inside the house when Claire arrived. She knew about the secret Claire intended to reveal, and she had every reason to fear what Claire might tell Daniel. Public suspicion turned toward Rebecca almost instantly. To outsiders, the case seemed almost too obvious. Rebecca had been Claire's closest friend. She had become involved with Claire's husband. She had argued with Claire. She knew the house. She knew Daniel. And she knew exactly what Claire had discovered. Every detail appeared to point in the same direction. People began asking the question detectives were deliberately refusing to answer too quickly. Was Rebecca responsible for Claire's death? The detectives understood why suspicion had fallen on her. She had motive, opportunity, and access. But those three things alone did not prove what happened. They needed evidence. More importantly, they needed Rebecca's version of the missing minutes. So investigators brought her in for questioning. From the beginning, her behavior was difficult to interpret. At certain moments, Rebecca appeared cold and defensive. She answered questions briefly, sometimes becoming irritated when detectives challenged her statements. Then, without warning, her demeanor changed. She appeared frightened. Not simply nervous about being questioned, but genuinely afraid of something. The detectives noticed the contradiction. They asked whether she had been expecting Claire that night. Rebecca initially avoided giving a direct answer. Eventually, she admitted that Claire had confronted her. Yes, she said, Claire had come to the house. Yes, they had argued. And yes, Claire had threatened to expose the secret she had once promised to keep. But Rebecca insisted that the confrontation had not ended in violence. She told detectives that Claire left the house alive. According to Rebecca, Claire had gathered her things, continued arguing, and eventually walked out. Rebecca claimed she watched her leave. That statement immediately created another problem. If Claire had walked away alive, where had she gone? And why had surveillance footage shown Claire entering the neighborhood, but never clearly leaving it? Detectives returned to the timeline. They asked Rebecca to describe exactly what happened after Claire left. Who did she call? Where did she go? What did she do afterward? Rebecca provided answers, but several details did not fit comfortably with the evidence already collected. The detectives did not accuse her of lying outright. Instead, they kept asking the same questions from different angles. Eventually, one question stopped the interview. Why didn't you report Claire missing? Rebecca became quiet. The detectives explained that Claire had disappeared from work, stopped responding to messages, and was eventually found dead. If Rebecca genuinely believed Claire had left the house alive, why had she not contacted anyone when Claire failed to return? Why had she not called Daniel? Why had she not contacted Claire's family? Why had she not reported her disappearance? Rebecca struggled to answer. She said she assumed Claire wanted to be left alone. She claimed Claire had threatened to expose her and had been angry enough to disappear temporarily. But detectives were not convinced. A close friend disappearing immediately after a serious confrontation should have raised questions. Instead, Rebecca had apparently done nothing. That silence became one of the most suspicious parts of her story. Yet detectives still refused to conclude that suspicion was proof. There were possibilities they had not eliminated. Rebecca could have been hiding something. She could have been protecting someone else. Or she could have been terrified because Claire's secret had placed her in danger too. The investigators returned to the folder Claire had carried into the house. Some documents were recovered. Others were missing. That detail suddenly became important. If Claire had arrived with evidence, and Rebecca knew what that evidence contained, then someone had a reason to make sure certain pieces never reached Daniel. The detectives now had two separate mysteries. What happened to Claire after she entered the house? And what exactly was inside the missing portion of Claire's folder? Rebecca continued insisting that she had not killed her friend. But every answer seemed to create another question. And as investigators prepared to search deeper into Rebecca's past, they realized that Claire's secret might not have been the only thing Rebecca had been trying to hide. There was another connection waiting to be uncovered, one that could explain why Claire had become suspicious in the first place, and why someone might have wanted her evidence to disappear. The unanswered questions surrounding Rebecca's story eventually pushed investigators toward the person who had been at the center of Claire's life from the beginning, Daniel. For days, Daniel had presented himself as the devastated husband caught between two women. He insisted that his relationship with Claire had ended before her disappearance, and that he had tried to keep his distance afterward. But detectives began examining the parts of his story that could be checked. The first problem appeared in his financial records. Investigators discovered several unexplained withdrawals around the time of Claire's disappearance. The amounts were not enough to prove anything by themselves, but the timing caught their attention. Daniel had no convincing explanation for some of the transactions. Then detectives examined his phone records. The records contradicted one of his most important claims. Daniel had repeatedly contacted Claire after insisting that they had stopped speaking. Some calls were brief. Others lasted long enough to suggest that their relationship had not ended as completely as Daniel wanted investigators to believe. When confronted with the records, Daniel attempted to explain them away. He said Claire had continued reaching out and that he had occasionally answered because he wanted to prevent the situation from becoming worse. But another discovery was far more serious. Daniel had lied about where he was on the night Claire disappeared. The detectives already had surveillance footage showing Claire entering the neighborhood. Now they had reason to believe Daniel had been closer to her final movements than he had admitted. During another interrogation, investigators pressed him repeatedly. Eventually, Daniel changed his story. He admitted that he had returned to the house after Rebecca went upstairs. He said he had not wanted to argue with her and believed the house had become too tense. Then he made the admission detectives had been waiting for. He found Claire in the backyard. Daniel insisted that when he discovered her, she was already dead. According to his new account, he immediately panicked. The detectives asked him why. Daniel said he knew what everything would look like. Claire was dead on property connected to him. Rebecca was inside the house, and both of them had already been involved in the conflict that investigators were now examining. But one question remained impossible to avoid. If Daniel had discovered Claire's body, why had he not called the police? Why had he not contacted emergency services? Why had he not told anyone what he had found? Daniel struggled to answer. For several moments, he said nothing. Then he broke down. He admitted that he believed Rebecca had killed Claire. He said he was terrified that Rebecca would be arrested and that everything they had built together would disappear. Instead of calling for help, Daniel made a decision that would permanently change the investigation. He said he buried Claire's body because he believed protecting Rebecca was the only way to save the life they had built together. The detectives listened carefully. His confession explained why Claire had been found where she was. It explained why Daniel had lied about returning to the house. And it explained why he had hidden the discovery. But it did not explain everything. There was still one detail that disturbed investigators more than any other. During his account, Daniel began describing Claire's injuries. He mentioned specific details about where she had been hurt and the nature of some of those injuries. The detectives immediately stopped him. Those details had never been released publicly. Daniel could not have learned them from news reports. He could not have known them from public statements. And if he had truly discovered Claire only after she was already dead, detectives needed to understand exactly how he knew what her injuries looked like. The room became silent. Daniel realized what had happened. His attempt to explain his actions had created a new problem far more serious than the lies he had already admitted. The detectives now had to consider a possibility they had not previously been willing to accept. Daniel might not have been merely covering for Rebecca. He might have known more about Claire's final moments than he was admitting. Detectives compared every statement Daniel had made. Each version contained a different detail, and every admission made the previous one harder to believe. Rebecca claimed Claire left alive. Daniel claimed he found her dead. Both stories left the unanswered gap. What happened during those missing minutes? Investigators knew that answer could reveal who was responsible for Claire's death and expose the truth hidden inside the house. The next question was no longer simply who had killed Claire. It was who had been with her when she died. The question of who had been with Claire when she died led investigators back to the secret Rebecca had spent years protecting. Daniel's knowledge of Claire's injuries had already shattered his carefully constructed story. Now detectives needed to understand what Claire had discovered about Rebecca before that final confrontation. They began with Rebecca's past. Years earlier, Rebecca had been involved in a deeply troubled relationship. According to records and people who knew her at the time, the relationship had become controlling and dangerous before ending in a violent confrontation. Claire had been there afterward. She had helped Rebecca escape that chapter of her life. She had offered her a place to stay, listened to what had happened, and promised to keep the details private. For years, Claire kept that promise. But investigators discovered that Rebecca's version of those events had changed over time. The differences were subtle at first. Rebecca had described the final night as a desperate attempt to escape. She claimed she had been frightened and had simply tried to protect herself. Claire eventually discovered that the story was incomplete. Important details had been left out. Other details had been changed. And one part of Rebecca's account appeared to be completely false. The detectives believed Claire had uncovered the truth while comparing Rebecca's statements with older records and messages. She realized that the secret she had protected was not merely embarrassing. It could affect the way Daniel understood the woman he had chosen. Then investigators discovered the connection that changed everything. Daniel had known Rebecca before their affair became public. Not only had he known her, but records suggested he had already been helping her financially and emotionally. There were payments. There were private communications. There were conversations that suggested their relationship had begun long before Daniel admitted becoming romantically involved with her. That discovery gave Claire a new reason to question everything. If Daniel and Rebecca had already been close, then Daniel's explanation of how their relationship began could not be trusted completely. Claire had proof. Investigators recovered copies of messages and financial records that appeared to show Daniel supporting Rebecca before he officially left Claire. Some communications were affectionate. Others suggested a level of familiarity that seemed impossible to explain as an ordinary friendship. Claire had apparently recognized the significance immediately. She was not simply trying to prove that Daniel had cheated. She wanted him to understand that the relationship he believed had begun after his marriage deteriorated might actually have started much earlier. That distinction mattered. It meant Daniel may have been living two different stories at the same time. One story was the version he had told Claire. The other was the reality Rebecca had shared with him privately. Claire had intended to put those stories side by side. She wanted Daniel to see the contradictions for himself. But the evidence still could not answer the most important question. Who killed Claire? The investigators now understood why Rebecca had been terrified of the folder. They understood why Daniel had lied about his contact with Claire. They understood why both of them had reasons to keep the truth buried. Yet motive was not proof. The documents showed deception, secrecy, and a relationship that appeared to have started earlier than either person admitted. They did not establish who caused Claire's death. And there was another problem. Some of Claire's evidence was still missing. The folder she carried into the house had contained more than the material detectives had recovered. One crucial piece appeared to have disappeared after the confrontation. If that missing evidence could be found, investigators believed it might finally connect the secret to Claire's death. For now, they had two suspects, two conflicting stories, and one dead woman whose final moments remained unexplained. Detectives also learned that Claire had not planned to reveal everything at once. Her notes suggested she intended to confront Daniel with enough evidence to force him to ask questions, then reveal the information if he still defended Rebecca. That made the missing material significant. It may have contained the detail that Rebecca feared most, or it may have explained why Daniel had become involved in her life so soon. Investigators returned to the house and searched, focusing on places where papers could have been hidden or destroyed. They found fragments, but nothing that answered the question. The evidence continued pointing toward both Daniel and Rebecca, yet neither could be placed at the moment Claire died. The closer detectives came to the truth, the more complicated the case became. The investigation had uncovered the secret Claire died trying to reveal, but it had not yet uncovered the person who silenced her. And somewhere in the missing evidence was the clue that could finally identify the killer. The missing evidence had narrowed the possibilities, but it had not answered the central question. Investigators now knew Claire had entered the house carrying proof that Daniel and Rebecca had lied about the beginning of their relationship. They also knew both suspects had changed their stories. So detectives rebuilt the night minute by minute. They began with phone records. Claire had contacted Daniel before arriving. Daniel had exchanged messages with Rebecca. Calls were made during the confrontation, while other communications stopped suddenly afterward. The timing created a sequence that could be compared against surveillance footage from nearby streets and statements given by witnesses. The evidence placed Claire at the house. There was no longer any reasonable dispute about that. She had arrived determined to confront both of them. According to the reconstruction, Claire entered carrying the folder that contained documents, photographs, and messages. She confronted Daniel first, accusing him of lying about when his relationship with Rebecca had actually begun. Rebecca entered the argument soon afterward. The confrontation quickly became emotional. Claire demanded that Daniel look at the evidence. Rebecca insisted Claire was twisting the past to destroy them. Daniel became angry and accused Claire of deliberately humiliating him. Then the argument crossed a line. Daniel admitted that he grabbed Claire during the confrontation. He insisted it was not intended to seriously hurt her. He said Claire was trying to leave. The argument became physical, and he reacted without thinking. Rebecca remembered the moment differently. She claimed Daniel became aggressive and caused Claire to fall. Daniel denied that. He said Rebecca pushed Claire. For several minutes, the three accounts became impossible to separate. Each person blamed another. Each version contained pieces that matched the evidence, followed by details that directly contradicted it. Claire fell during the struggle. That much appeared certain. But the detectives discovered something neither suspect had anticipated. Claire had survived the fall. The forensic evidence showed that the injury itself had not immediately caused her death. She had been alive afterward. That discovery changed the entire case. If Claire had survived, then there had been time for someone to call for help. There had been time for an ambulance. There had been time for someone to save her. But nobody did. Instead, someone made a decision. The investigators returned to Daniel's confession. He had admitted finding Claire in the backyard and hiding her body. But his statement did not explain what happened between the fall and the moment he supposedly discovered her. Rebecca's story created the same problem. She claimed Daniel caused the fall, yet she could not explain why she failed to seek medical assistance. Both suspects had reasons to fear the consequences. Daniel feared losing Rebecca and facing responsibility for what had happened. Rebecca feared the exposure of her secret and the collapse of the relationship she had built with Daniel. But fear alone did not establish who had made the final decision. Detectives examined the phone records again. There was a critical period after Claire was injured when no emergency call was made. Instead, communications between Daniel and Rebecca suggested they were focused on what to do next. The investigators realized that the most important evidence was not simply what happened during the argument. It was what happened afterward. Someone looked at Claire and understood that she was still alive. Someone knew she needed help. Someone chose not to provide it. That meant the death could no longer be explained as an unfortunate accident followed by panic. The fall may have been accidental, but what followed was not. The case had crossed a critical boundary. Investigators were no longer trying to determine whether Claire had died during an argument. They were trying to identify who had deliberately allowed her to die. Daniel and Rebecca had both confessed to being present. Both had admitted enough to place themselves inside the house. Both had blamed the other. And both had something powerful to lose if the truth became public. The detectives now understood that one of them was lying about the final minutes. But they still needed proof. Then forensic investigators found a detail at the scene that neither suspect had mentioned. It suggested Claire had been moved after the fall. That meant someone had remained with her. Someone had made a conscious choice. And that choice would soon become the evidence that separated guilt from suspicion. The discovery also explained why the backyard had become so important. Claire had not simply ended up there by chance. Her position suggested that someone had moved her after the confrontation, creating a false impression about where she had been injured. Detectives now had to determine who had the strength, opportunity, and reason to move her, and whether that person had acted alone carefully. The forensic discovery that Claire had been moved after the fall changed the balance of the investigation. Detectives now knew that the final minutes were not simply a confused aftermath of an argument. Someone had remained with Claire, understood that she needed help, and chose silence. That realization brought Daniel and Rebecca back into separate interrogation rooms. For the first time, detectives stopped asking them what happened and began showing them what they already knew. They presented Daniel with phone records, surveillance footage, financial evidence, and the contradictions in his statements. They reminded him that he had admitted returning to the house, finding Claire, and hiding her body. Then they turned to Rebecca. They showed her evidence proving that she had been present during the confrontation. They showed the messages that placed her in contact with Daniel afterward. Most importantly, they explained that Claire had survived the initial incident. Rebecca became visibly shaken. The detectives told her that someone had known Claire was still alive. That person had failed to call for help. Rebecca initially denied knowing anything more. She insisted that Daniel had caused the injuries and that she had been too frightened to intervene. But investigators challenged her. They asked why she had stayed. Why had she protected Daniel? Why had she allowed Claire to remain without assistance? Rebecca finally stopped defending herself. She admitted that Daniel was responsible for the injuries that ultimately became fatal. According to her confession, the confrontation had become physical after Claire refused to leave. Daniel lost control during the argument, and Claire was injured. Rebecca said she was shocked by what happened. But then came the admission that changed her role in the case. Claire was still alive. Rebecca knew it. She could have called an ambulance. She could have contacted the police. She could have told someone what had happened. Instead, she stood beside Daniel. She watched as Claire became less responsive, and she did nothing to seek help. The detectives asked why. Rebecca's answer was painfully simple. She chose Daniel. She was afraid that if she called for help, the truth about their relationship would come out. Claire's evidence would be discovered. Daniel would be arrested. Everything Rebecca had fought to protect would collapse. So she remained silent. Daniel, meanwhile, made his own decision. After Claire died, he buried her body. The detectives now understood why both suspects had told different versions of the same story. Daniel had been protecting himself and Rebecca from the consequences of what he had done. Rebecca had been protecting Daniel, their relationship, and the secrets Claire had threatened to expose. Their lies were different because their fears were different. But the result was the same. Claire had been left without the help that might have saved her. The investigation had begun with a simple question. Which one of them killed Claire? Now detectives realized that question was too narrow. Daniel had caused the fatal injuries. Rebecca had knowingly failed to get help. Daniel had hidden the body. Rebecca had helped preserve the silence. Neither could honestly claim to have been an innocent witness to Claire's final moments. The case was no longer about one person's hatred. It was about two people making separate choices that became part of the same tragedy. As detectives compared the confession with the physical evidence, they noticed that Rebecca was careful about one particular moment. She described the argument clearly, but became uncertain whenever investigators asked what happened immediately after Claire was injured. Her uncertainty mattered because the timeline suggested there had been enough time for a completely different outcome. Daniel was questioned again. This time, detectives told him Rebecca had confessed. His reaction was immediate. He accused her of blaming him to save herself. But when investigators mentioned that Claire had survived the initial injury, Daniel stopped arguing. He finally acknowledged that he had known Claire needed medical attention. He still insisted he had panicked. Yet panic could no longer explain every decision. The investigators had uncovered a chain of choices, an argument, a fatal injury, a refusal to seek help, and finally an attempt to conceal what had happened. Each decision had brought Daniel and Rebecca closer to the same consequence. Yet detectives still needed to determine exactly what happened during the confrontation and whether Rebecca's confession told the whole truth. Because one detail remained unexplained. Claire had arrived carrying evidence that could destroy their relationship. After her death, part of that evidence disappeared. The missing evidence might reveal whether Rebecca had confessed everything, or whether she was still protecting Daniel from one final secret. And that final secret could determine how the court would ultimately understand their responsibility for Claire's death. Now the detectives had to determine which evidence would survive the scrutiny of court and testimony. The missing evidence had finally been found, but its discovery did not bring the investigation the sense of closure anyone expected. Instead, it completed a chain of choices that had begun long before Claire entered that house. Daniel was arrested and charged in connection with Claire's death and the concealment of her body. Rebecca was also taken into custody and faced charges related to her role in what happened, including her failure to seek medical assistance after Claire was injured. The arrests quickly became national news. People had followed the case from the beginning, first believing it was a story about a broken marriage, then a secret affair, and finally a murder. What made the case especially disturbing was not simply how Claire died, but who had been beside her when she needed help most. Daniel had been her husband. Rebecca had been her closest friend. They were the two people Claire had trusted most. Now both were facing the consequences of choices they could never undo. Claire's family refused to turn the funeral into a public spectacle. They held a quiet service attended by relatives and a small circle of people who had known her before the investigation transformed her life into headlines. There were no cameras inside, no dramatic speeches, only photographs, memories, and an empty place where Claire should have been. Outside, reporters waited for statements, but the family offered little. They did not want Claire remembered only as the woman at the center of a scandal. They wanted people to remember who she had been before betrayal, suspicion, and violence took over the story. Eventually, the house connected to the investigation was no longer occupied. The backyard was cleared. The disturbed earth where Claire had been found disappeared beneath fresh ground, leaving no visible sign to someone passing by. But investigators could not erase the image from their minds. That patch of earth had become a symbol of everything the case represented. a place where someone had chosen secrecy over truth, a place where Claire's final moments had been hidden from the world, and a place where the consequences of several selfish decisions had finally become impossible to conceal. As the case moved forward, the detectives kept returning to the same moral question. Was Claire destroyed by one betrayal? The evidence suggested something more complicated. She had been surrounded by people who repeatedly chose themselves over her. Daniel chose Rebecca over his wife. Rebecca chose Daniel over her best friend. And when Claire needed someone to choose her life over their secrets, neither did. That was what made the case so painful. The tragedy was not created by one moment alone. It grew through a series of decisions, each one making the next easier to justify. Daniel chose deception. Rebecca chose silence. Then, when the consequences became unavoidable, they chose concealment. Claire had spent her final days trying to reveal the truth. She believed that if Daniel understood everything, he would finally see what had been hidden from him. She was right about one thing. The truth did matter. But by the time it was fully uncovered, Claire was no longer there to see it. Her investigation had begun with questions about Rebecca's past, but it ended by exposing something much larger: how easily loyalty can become an excuse for silence. The detectives never forgot that distinction. They had solved the mystery of what happened, but the emotional truth remained. Claire had trusted two people to stand beside her, and when the moment came, both stood beside themselves instead of saving her. Months after the arrests, detectives returned to the evidence room and reviewed the final piece of evidence Claire had left behind. It contained no confession, no dramatic accusation, no final message naming her killer. Instead, there was only a handwritten sentence. The detective read it once. Then again. The words were simple, almost painfully ordinary. Someone always knows the truth, even when everyone else chooses to look away. The sentence became the final piece of Claire's story. She had spent her last days believing that exposing the truth could change everything. In the end, it did. But it came too late to save her. The case would continue through courtrooms, testimony, and arguments over responsibility. Daniel and Rebecca would each have to answer for their choices, and the legal system would determine the consequences. But Claire's final sentence carried a lesson that required no verdict. Sometimes the most devastating betrayal is not what someone does to you. It is what they refuse to do when you need them most. Claire needed someone to speak, someone to call for help, someone to put her life above their fear. No one did. And that was the truth Claire had been trying to uncover all along.